Executions at Florida State Prison. Death by lethal injection. The steel door to the execution chamber shut with a hollow clang that echoed through Florida State Prison. It was 6 p.m. in Starke, Florida. Outside the walls, protesters and reporters waited behind barricades. Inside, the atmosphere was tight, controlled, silent. In the witness room, a small group stared through thick glass. On the other side, under bright white lights, a man lay strapped to a narrow gurney. At exactly 6:12 p.m., the warden gave the signal, and 4 line ran from the inmate's arm through a small hole in the wall. A clear liquid began moving through the tubing. Correctional officers stood rigid along the edges of the chamber. No one spoke. No one shifted. Seconds passed. Then something went wrong. The man's body tightened. His jaw clenched. His chest strained against the leather straps. Witnesses leaned forward. One officer looked toward the medical team behind the curtain. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Inside Florida's death chamber, this was not supposed to happen. The inmate was Alan Lee Davis, convicted of the 1982 murders of a pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters in Jacksonville. After years of appeals, his execution by electric chair in 1999 would spark national controversy. But before Florida fully transitioned to lethal injection as its primary method, scrutiny over its execution procedures had already been building. Florida State Prison, the state's primary execution site since 1923, had carried out dozens of executions. For decades, the electric chair known as Old Sparky defined capital punishment in the state. But after several highly publicized problems, including flames seen during past executions, Florida lawmakers approved lethal injection as an alternative in 2000. Eventually, lethal injection became the default method. The execution chamber at Florida State Prison was designed to be clinical, controlled, and final, a place where chaos had no permission to exist. But on execution nights, tension always hovered in the air. Officers assigned to the death chamber underwent specific training. The inmate would be moved from death row earlier that day into a holding cell just steps away from the chamber. Final meals were delivered. Spiritual advisors were allowed visits. Phones rang constantly in administrative offices as courts reviewed last-minute appeals. For years, Florida's lethal injection protocol used a 3-drug combination: a sedative, a paralytic, and a drug to stop the heart. Later, the state shifted to a single-drug protocol using etomidate, following national drug shortages and legal challenges. Each change followed lawsuits. Each lawsuit followed scrutiny. And each execution placed enormous pressure on the staff inside those walls. Because if anything went wrong, even for seconds, the entire nation would see it. Back in the chamber, as witnesses watched Alan Lee Davis struggle against the restraints, questions filled the room. Was the sedative working? Had the 4-line been properly inserted? And how would this moment reshape Florida's use of lethal injection forever? Years before that execution chamber door closed, Alan Lee Davis arrived at Florida State Prison in chains. Convicted in 1983, Davis had been sentenced to death in Duval County. His crimes had shocked Florida. A pregnant woman and her 2 young daughters had been killed inside their home. The jury recommended death, and the judge agreed. Davis was sent to death row at Florida State Prison in Starke, the same facility where executions were carried out. Death row at Florida State Prison was isolated from the general population. Inmates lived in small, single cells. Meals were passed through narrow slots. Recreation was limited and tightly supervised. Movement required escorts and restraints. The routine was strict, repetitive, and emotionally draining. For Davis, like many death row inmates, the appeals process stretched on for years. Motions were filed in state and federal courts. Attorneys challenged jury instructions, evidence, and sentencing procedures. Each time a court denied relief, another appeal followed. The waiting became its own kind of sentence. Inside the prison, officers monitored death row closely. Executions were scheduled and rescheduled. Some inmates spent more than a decade under a death warrant shadow. In 1999, Davis's final appeals were denied. The governor signed a death warrant. The execution date was set for July 8th. The days leading up to an execution followed a rigid pattern. The inmate was moved to a death watch cell, closer to the execution chamber. Guards maintained constant observation. Every movement was logged. Attorneys made last-minute filings. Media outlets prepared breaking news alerts. At the time, Florida still used the electric chair as its primary method. Lethal injection had been authorized, but was not yet the default. Davis chose the electric chair. On execution night, the chamber was prepared hours in advance. Witnesses included journalists, family members of the victims, and prison officials. Medical staff stood by. The electric chair was tested multiple times before use. When the execution began, Davis was strapped into old Sparky. A leather mask covered his face. A wet sponge was placed under the headpiece to conduct electricity. But when the switch was pulled, witnesses later reported seeing blood near his face. Some described flames or smoke. The images quickly spread through media reports nationwide. The execution was declared complete, but controversy erupted immediately. Critics argued the electric chair caused unnecessary suffering. Lawsuits were filed, claiming the method violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Florida's death penalty system was once again under intense national scrutiny. Lawmakers faced pressure. And inside Florida State Prison, staff realized that the future of executions in the state was about to change forever. The backlash from Allen Lee Davis's execution did not fade. Photographs taken after the execution showed visible injuries to his face. Media outlets across the United States published detailed reports. Advocacy groups demanded investigations. Legal experts questioned whether the electric chair could continue under constitutional standards. Florida's Supreme Court reviewed challenges. Lawmakers debated alternatives. Other states had already shifted toward lethal injection, promoting it as a more clinical and less visibly violent method. In 2000, Florida officially made lethal injection the default method of execution. Inmates could still choose the electric chair, but if they declined, lethal injection would be used. Inside Florida State Prison, the execution chamber was modified. The electric chair remained, but a gurney was installed. Medical equipment was added. Staff received new training. Protocols were written and rewritten. The lethal injection procedure was designed to follow strict steps. First, the inmate would be strapped to the gurney. 2 4-lines would be inserted, one primary, one backup. A sedative would render the inmate unconscious. Then a paralytic would stop muscle movement. Finally, a drug would stop the heart. But across the country, lethal injection protocols were being challenged in court. Drug manufacturers began restricting the sale of execution drugs. States scrambled to find alternatives. Florida eventually adopted a single-drug protocol using etomidate as the sedative. Each change brought new lawsuits. Each lawsuit delayed executions. Yet the chamber doors continued to close. For correctional officers assigned to execution duty, the psychological weight was heavy. Many described sleepless nights before an execution. Some requested transfers after participating in multiple procedures. The job required calm hands and steady focus, even as protesters gathered outside the prison gates in Starke. Executions at Florida State Prison became less frequent, but they did not stop. And every time the 4-line was inserted, every time the warden read the final warrant, the memory of past controversies lingered in the room. Because the lesson from Allen Lee Davis's execution was clear. When the system designed to deliver a controlled and clinical death shows even a hint of failure, the entire nation watches. And inside that silent chamber, under bright white lights, there is no room for error.